All right, so we're going to be talking about the death of Star Trek Deep Space Nine actor Rene Auberjonois. I believe I did pronounce his name correctly. Um, and some of our thoughts about him. I pulled up an article that just has a bunch of uh, a lot of Twitter tributes from various Trek alumni. Um, at that's kind of to scroll there in the background. But I thought mainly Dave and I would like to just talk about our thoughts about Mr. Auberginois and how we first got to hear about him and know about him and all that stuff. So I'll start with you, Dave. How did you first hear about Mr. Auberginois?
Well, I was struggling to pronounce his name earlier, so if I say it slightly wrong, everyone please forgive me. It's not meant as a sign of disrespect at all. It's just I'm struggling with saying his name. Um, I first noticed him on Benson as a kid. I used to watch Benson all the time. He was sort of the antagonist of the show, the character you either loved or hated. He was always sort of like a thorn in Benson's side. Um, and then he was that actor who was just in a bunch of different stuff. It's like, oh, it's that guy from Benson again. He just kept showing up in things. Um, and I got to where when I saw him, he was kind of like a welcome, someone you were kind of familiar with, when he got cast as Odo in Deep Space Nine, I thought it was a little weird because I felt like he was maybe a little bit too old for that role at that time because I'd seen him on television, it seemed like my entire life. Um, but he was really great as Odo and brought a lot to that character. I mean, he's a very talent. He was a very very talented actor, and Odo is one of my favorite Star Trek characters. Deep Space Nine is one of my favorite Star Trek shows, and part of it is because of Odo. I love that character and what he brought to the show in terms of his character's dynamic and everything. Um, but beyond that, I have a Batman callback. Um, Mr. Auberginois actually played, I think it was Dr. Burton or something. It was a callback to Tim Burton. He shows up at the very, very end, the tail end of Batman Forever. He's the psychiatrist who is working with Jim Carrey's Edward Nygma, or the Riddler. It's a very brief part.
Really?
However,
I
yes.
didn't know that.
However, he did the audio book adaptation of the novelization of Batman Forever. And he does all of the characters. And the novelization has a lot more information about Dick Grayson, a lot more information about Nicole Kidman's character. Um, it has a lot more information about Harvey Dent and his relationship with Bruce. And it's just a really great audio book adaptation of Batman Forever. And I have a fondness. I think people who know me really well know I love the movie Batman Forever. Um, and it's such a great adaptation of it. And it's so amazing to hear him do all the different voices and all the different characters and set everything up. And it's one of my favorite Batman things is actually that audiobook adaptation of the novelization for Batman Forever. So when I think of Rene Auberjonois, I actually closely associate him with Batman Forever because of that. So he's just been one of those great actors who has been a part of so many things that I've enjoyed over the course of my life. That it's fitting we're talking about him and talking about our memories of him. I never had the chance to meet him at a convention or anything. I don't think he ever did a convention that I ever did. So I've never really had a chance to really meet him per se. I don't have a lot of personal stories, but just for me personally, growing up, being a fan of genre entertainment, I mean, not only Star Trek, but he for me was an important part of Batman as well, because of that adaptation. So that for me is going to be my thoughts and remembrances for Rene Auberjonois. What about you, Eric?
Well, just like you, I remember him from Benson. And I used to watch Benson all the time when I was growing up. It was one of those shows that I really liked. And of course, his character was very unlikable. very unlikable character, very annoying character. The show is obviously about Benson, and he was kind of like Benson's kind of foil. Well, Benson had a lot of people. He pretty much made fun of everybody on the show. There was nobody safe on that show from Benson. That was kind of the idea, right? But I remember him on that show, and I'm not sure if when Deep Space Nine came out, I even made the connection that it was the same actor, because his name is very difficult to pronounce. Like I said, I was a kid. I was very unaware as a kid who actors were, especially supporting actors.
Right.
So I don't know if I even knew who he was when Deep Space Nine came along. I think as the show actually came out, I kind of realized, hey, that's the guy from Benson under all that makeup,
Right.
And I think about that because I think that's a real testament of a great actor, is that you cannot necessarily recognize him from part to part. And I think Rene was one of those kind of actors. He was in so many things. I didn't know he was in Batman Forever. He's in so many things. I didn't realize one little gem I got from all this and the Twitter storm when he passed. Somebody put out that I guess he was cut from Star Trek 6, but he's in the director's cut. Have you seen that scene?
Yeah, he plays Colonel West.
Yeah.
He's actually one of the military analysts who comes in. He's the one who tells them that, frankly, sir, they could kick their chronometers or whatever. It's kind of an interesting little scene. And it's interesting because I think I've mostly seen the director's cut. Like, I'm a big director's cut guy, so when I go to buy stuff, if there's a director's cut, I always get it. So I always associate his character of Colonel West, with Star Trek, and with specifically Star Trek 6. I consider it an important part of that story. So
I've never seen it. I saw it in the theater. I've seen it on cable many times. Anytime it comes on TV or something, I watch it because I like Star Trek 6, but I don't own it. And I never got the director's cut. I never seen it. So I didn't even know he was in it. And so I saw that clip and I was like, that's a pretty cool clip. And I had no idea he was even in the movie.
Well, he's the Klingon with the rifle that when they pull the mask off, that's him.
Right.
He was the assassin.
But again, I think a real testament to an actor is the fact that you don't necessarily recognize him in multiple roles.
Right.
And I think that's why he had a really interesting career, because on the one hand, he was a regular cast member of Benson, which was a pretty big show in the 80s. And then he was a regular cast member on Deep Space Nine, which was a pretty big show in the 90s. But in between and before and after, he did so many other things and so many different things, different parts where you see people talking online and stuff. It's like, oh, well, he was in this too. Oh, did you know he was in this? Did you know he was in that? I was like, no, I didn't. I had no idea. So he just had an amazing career, and like I said, I just think that's the ultimate testament that you can make to an actor, is say, hey, I didn't recognize you in that other movie at all. That means you're a real actor. And I think that his talent was just off the scales. And also, it's kind of interesting when you talk about Star Trek actors. Very few of them were established prior to their version of Star Trek. There are exceptions, of course, and he's one of them. I mean, this is a guy who was on a network television show, in the 80s as a regular cast member, and then he came on to Deep Space Nine, and obviously Avery Brooks also was from a successful television show, but the rest of the cast really wasn't. So I appreciate things like that too. The fact that this was someone who was involved with sort of, if you will, mainstream Hollywood type stuff, and was willing to get into genre, because that was not his shtick. That was not his thing.
Right.
And I always appreciate that with Star Trek, when an actor who isn't necessarily big on science fiction does it, agrees to do it, especially as a regular cast member. It's one thing to be a guest star, because Star Trek, through its various incarnations, has so many huge guest stars, but he was a regular cast member, and that can bring baggage. It's happened to the best of them. A lot of Trek actors, they get typecast. But I think that I guess he was confident enough in his abilities, which I think were vast, that he was willing to take on that challenge and be in a very sort of iconic role, as Odo, as an alien, because that's obviously he stands out. He stands out very much so. He's also, one thing I really wish, because I was at Star Trek Vegas, in August, and he was there, but I didn't get to see him, and I didn't get to go to any of his panels. And I'd always wanted to talk to him because I always wanted to say, I think it's so cool that basically you're like the only actor that I know of, or for Star Trek, at least the main cast, that played a non-humanoid.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered how he approached that, being that's such a different type of alien, because all the other aliens that we have in Star Trek, Klingons, Romulans, whatever, all these other big classic Vulcans, they're still humanoids. And what's so different about Odo is that Odo was a shapeshifter, and his natural state was basically a bunch of goo,
Right.
And so I always thought that was really interesting that he was able to do that, and in a lot of ways a very convincing way, because you feel, watching Deep Space Nine, you feel the isolation of Odo a lot, and the fact that he knows he's so different than everybody else. And he did a really good job, and he did it in I think a good subtle way, in the way that he portrayed Odo and Odo's sort of isolation of being the only one like himself. And then of course it even goes worse, where he finds his people and he hates them. His people
Right.
are revolting to him,
Right.
and so it's even worse for him. Odo has one of the greatest character arcs in Deep Space Nine, and of course making that work ultimately came up on his shoulders, and I think he did a very good job. I'm not a big fan of romance in Star Trek, like long-term romance, because I think a lot of times it kind of gets in the way of everything else, of the stuff that I want to see in Trek.
Right.
And this is one of the few romances that I really enjoyed. I have Nana Visitor's remarks up on the screen right now. And I always thought that the romance between Odo and Kira was just, like, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really good. It's tragic. It ends up being sort of a tragic romance, very, very, very bittersweet. But I like the idea that Odo at least kind of got his chance, because he had been basically loving Kira from afar. He had been friend zoned. I mean, a lot of people understand being friend zoned. That's pretty universal.
Right.
A lot of people understand that, and how much that hurts. And the fact that he overcame that, he got out of the friend zone, and he actually had a very passionate romance with Kira. And I always thought that was really interesting. And like I said, I like, for instance, I don't like the Cassidy. I don't like the Cisco's romance at all. I thought it just got in the way.
Right. Yeah.
I thought it just got in the way and was stupid, and I didn't like it. They also ripped it off from Babylon 5. But anyway, the freighter captain thing. So, but I never liked it. And most of the long-term romances, like, I don't like Chakotay and Seven. I hate that. I hate Chakotay and Seven. I think that was just out of the blue terrible. But this is a romance, long-term Trek romance, that I really enjoyed, that I really liked. And I think a lot of it comes down to Rene's acting. I think the fact that he was able to convey that romance in such a really beautiful way, that's just, again, another tribute to the level of actor that he was. I really regret not meeting him, but I did have one story from the convention circuit, which was one of the first Star Trek conventions I went to as a kid, and one of the best ones I ever went to as a kid. It was DeForest Kelley, Michael Dorn, and Armin Shimmerman, and this was like the first year of Deep Space Nine, and this was like one of the last appearances by DeForest Kelley, by the way, which I was always really happy I got to see him in person. I didn't get to meet him, but I got to see him in person, and I got to see him talk, and that was a big thrill for me as a kid.
Right.
And Michael Dorn was there. I was super into The Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine had just come out. And I was one of those people that the first season of Deep Space Nine was kind of like, ugh, I thought it was like kind of all over the place. Basically, the first 2.5 seasons for me are kind of just up and down, all over the place. And I didn't stay with Deep Space Nine initially, but I was watching it at the time. And Armin Shimmerman was one of the guests. And Armin Shimmerman was really cool, and he actually did a signing, and he did that thing where he basically waited for everybody. And I went and I got to meet Armin Shimmerman. I got a picture with him and all that stuff, and I talked to him. And I remember one of the things that people were asking, everybody was asking Armin was, how do you pronounce Renee's last name? Because they like, nobody knew how to do it. So I just remember that people were constantly asking him that because he does have sort of an unusual last name that's difficult for a lot of Americans to pronounce. But that's the thing that I remember.
Right.
And I know a lot of people have heard that stories before where I heard a story on Twitter from somebody that where he was talking about at a convention, he went out of his way to tell everybody, this is how you pronounce my last name. So it was kind of a running joke with him. And that's my little story there. So I think it's a great loss for the Trek community. He was a great actor. I think it's like I said, I think it's a loss for Hollywood. He did do so many other things. Like I said, I remember him from Benson before Deep Space Nine, and so I just think that it is a big loss. But he had quite a career, and I definitely was a fan. Definitely a fan of Rene.
Yeah, I was too, and I, it's one of those things I've thought about this for forever, and I don't think and I'm not trying to nod to Batman Forever, but, whenever I used to watch the way that he would play Odo, for some reason, when it came to Kira, I always got the feeling that there was this Phantom of the Opera vibe with him. That he was this misshapen monster,
Yeah.
admiring her and wanting her from afar, but not sure how to close that gap, but always kind of being there. I always felt like that whenever I saw him interacting with Kira, that's what I always thought of in my mind was the Phantom from the Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there's definitely that vibe. There was actually a really cool episode. I don't know if you remember, where they ran into this planet where they basically had. It turned out that there was this sort of like time issue, and in essentially an alternate reality, they had crashed on the planet, and the people they were meeting were actually their descendants. Do you remember that episode?
Yes.
Okay. That is a standout Rene episode. That's a standout Rene episode because he got to appear as an older version of himself. Basically, he was like 300 years older, and he had gotten much better at shapeshifting to the point that he looked like Rene. He didn't look like Odo,
Right.
And he had this wonderful performance where basically he kind of seduces Kira. Kira suddenly like sees Odo in a completely different light,
Right.
because he's very smooth. He's got much more defined facial features now. He looks much more human, and just his whole demeanor, just very smooth. I just remember that because Odo's very stiff. Odo's very stiff.
Right.
But this older version of Odo was just like a smooth operator. Like he was good, and you could kind of see the sort of the idea was kind of forming in Kira's head that maybe the way she saw Odo wasn't all that was there, that there was more there than she saw, and that was the way she saw it, was because she saw this older version of him. So I think that's a standout performance. I wish I could remember the name of the episode, but that was a real standout performance where he got to play like a different version of Odo, where he really wasn't like that beast. He wasn't really like the Phantom of the Opera. He was more like this kind of smooth operator almost,
Right.
So yeah, that's a standout episode in my mind. I wish I could remember the name of it. So we good there?
I think so.